The streetlights barely cut through the thick American night, casting long, shifting shadows across the quiet suburban street. It was late, past midnight, when two uniformed officers, Miller and Jenkins, pulled over a modest sedan. John, the driver, had just left the bank, the crisp feeling of a substantial cash withdrawal still fresh in his mind. He'd been planning this for months, a down payment on a small garage, a new start. "License and registration, please." Miller's voice was too loud for the quiet street, a harsh bark that made John flinch slightly. John handed over his documents, his hand steady despite the sudden stop. Jenkins, a bulkier man, leaned against the patrol car, a silent, menacing presence. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Miller ordered, not waiting for John to respond before yanking the door open. John complied, his brow furrowed in confusion. There was no reason for this. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't swerved. Miller began a rough search of the car, his movements quick and aggressive. John watched, a knot forming in his stomach, as Miller's hand dipped under the driver's seat. He saw the glint of green, the thick stack of hundreds he'd just gotten. Miller pulled out the cash, fanning it with a sneer. Well, what do we have here?" he mumbled, more to himself than to John. Before John could even form a protest, Miller snatched the money, stuffing it into his own pocket with a practiced ease. Then, with a sudden shove, he slammed John against the side of his car. The metal dug into John's back, but he didn't cry out. As Miller held him, his other hand moved swiftly, planting a small, clear baggie into John's back pocket. Jenkins watched, a faint smirk playing on his lips, not saying a word, a silent partner in the act. Miller leaned in close, his breath hot against John's ear. "You don't say anything about this, understand? Or next time, it won't just be a little baggie we find. It'll be a whole lot worse. Got it, tough guy?" His voice was low, mocking, dripping with contempt. He finally let go, pushing John forward slightly. John stumbled, catching himself before he fell. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. His initial shock, a fleeting flicker in his eyes, quickly faded, replaced by something cold and hard. It was a look that unnerved Miller slightly, a silent, unblinking stare that held no fear, only a chilling resolve. It was the kind of look that made you wonder what was going on behind those eyes. As Miller turned to walk back to the patrol car, John subtly, almost imperceptibly, adjusted a small device on his left wrist. It was barely visible, a thin band that looked like a fitness tracker. Miller and Jenkins got back into their car, the engine purring to life. They drove off, their taillights disappearing around the bend. John stood alone on the dim street, the silence of the night pressing in. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small baggie Miller had planted, looking at it for a moment before dropping it. Then he pulled out his phone. The faint glow from his wrist device seemed to intensify slightly as he stared at the screen. "Some battles are won before they even begin," he muttered, his voice a low, steady rumble, devoid of anger, full of a chilling calm. He stood there for another moment, the streetlights reflecting off his unblinking eyes, before bringing the phone to his ear and making a call. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. John wasn't always just John. Before that night, before the corrupt cops and the planted evidence, he was a different kind of man, forged in a different kind of fire. He grew up in a small, close-knit community, nestled in America's Rust Belt, a town where the rhythm of life was set by factory whistles and the clank of old machinery. It was a place where people knew their neighbors, where a handshake still meant something, and where hard work wasn't just an ethic, it was a way of life. His family had a long history of service, not just in the military, but to the community itself. His grandfather had been a local mechanic, known for his honest repairs and a willingness to help anyone who broke down. His father, a veteran of Vietnam, had instilled in John a deep sense of discipline and integrity. These values weren't just talked about. They were lived, day in and day out. John carried that legacy with him, a quiet strength that underpinned everything he did. After high school, John joined the Navy, eventually becoming a SEAL. The years of intense training, the deployments, the constant pressure of combat, it all shaped him. It taught him to be observant, to plan meticulously, and to act decisively. It also left its mark, a certain guardedness in his eyes, a quiet intensity that most people mistook for shyness. When he returned home, the town felt both familiar and strangely distant. He appreciated the quiet pace, the genuine smiles, but he also carried the weight of experiences that no one in his hometown could truly understand. His dream was simple, almost old-fashioned, to open his own garage. Not a fancy dealership, but a place where people could trust the work, where an honest day's pay bought an honest repair. He had been saving for years, every penny squirreled away, meticulously planning the layout, even down to the kind of tools he'd buy. The stack of cash Miller had stolen was the down payment on the old, run-down building he'd finally found. A place he saw not as a derelict structure, but as the foundation of his future. It was more than just money. It was years of sacrifice, of living frugally, of building something solid for himself back in the world he'd fought to protect. Miller and Jenkins were also part of this community, at least on the surface. They'd grown up a few towns over, eventually joining the local police force. At first, they seemed like any other officers patrolling the streets, responding to calls. They were fixtures at local high school football games, their presence a seemingly normal part of the town's fabric. But slowly, subtly, things began to shift. Whispers started in the coffee shops, at the diner. A speeding ticket for a local business owner that seemed a little too aggressive. A minor public disturbance charge for a teenager whose parents had spoken out against a new town initiative. John, with his trained eye for detail and his deep-seated sense of justice, noticed these things more than most. He saw the way Miller's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the way Jenkins always seemed to be looking for an angle. He heard the hushed complaints from neighbors about fines that felt arbitrary, or minor infractions that seemed to escalate unnecessarily when one of them was involved. His trust in local authority, once absolute, began to fray at the edges. He'd seen abuse of power in faraway lands, but never expected to witness it so close to home, in the quiet streets he grew up on. Each incident, each story of bullying or intimidation, chipped away at his belief in the system. It wasn't just about the officers. It was about what they represented. The erosion of the very principles he'd sworn to uphold. He watched as the two officers, once just faces in the crowd, slowly but surely transformed into something darker, something that threatened the very fabric of the community he loved. The night Miller and Jenkins robbed him wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the breaking point. The culmination of a long, slow burn of disillusionment. The pattern of Miller and Jenkins' behavior became clearer over time, like watching a slow-motion car crash. It wasn't just isolated incidents. It was a steady drip of small abuses that eroded trust. John had heard the stories, seen the evidence, and each time it left a sour taste. There was the time they promised a group of small business owners they'd look into increasing night patrols after a string of minor break-ins. Instead, a week later, Two of those business owners found themselves facing hefty fines for minor zoning violations that had been ignored for years. It felt like a thinly veiled threat, a way to remind people who was in charge, who held the power to make life easy or hard. Then there was the incident with old Mrs. Henderson. She ran a small antique shop, a beloved local spot. Her grandson, a teenager, had been caught spray painting graffiti on a wall behind the old diner. It was a stupid kid mistake, easily cleaned up. But Miller and Jenkins made a big show of it, publicly humiliating the boy in front of his grandmother, threatening to press charges that would ruin his future. They only backed off after Mrs. Henderson, shaking, offered them a donation to the police charity fund, a fund no one else in town had ever heard of. John saw the look on her face, the way her shoulders slumped, the quiet despair that settled over her. It wasn't about justice. It was about power and intimidation. These weren't things that made headlines, or even things that most people openly talked about. They were the kind of incidents that festered in a small town, passed around in hushed tones over coffee or at the barber shop. People learned to keep their heads down, to avoid drawing attention. John watched as the officers manipulated minor infractions. A broken taillight could turn into a full inspection of your vehicle, finding every little thing wrong, often ending with a ticket for something that could have been fixed on the spot. Parking violations in front of businesses that didn't pay into their community outreach programs became suspiciously frequent. It was a slow, grinding process, designed to create a sense of helplessness. The officers built a kind of good old boys network, not with other upstanding citizens, but with those who benefited from their selective enforcement. They would turn a blind eye to certain things for certain people, while coming down hard on others. It created a divide, a quiet tension that permeated the town. John saw how vulnerable residents, especially those without connections or resources, were often the easiest targets. He saw how the officers would dismiss legitimate complaints from citizens, often with a dismissive wave of the hand or a sarcastic comment, making people feel foolish for even trying to speak up. Each time John witnessed one of these events or heard a new story, his internal sense of right and wrong screamed. His SEAL training had ingrained in him a deep respect for integrity, for protecting the innocent, for upholding a code. To see that code so casually trampled, right here in his own community, was a personal affront. It wasn't just abstract injustice. It was a betrayal of the values he lived by. He kept quiet, observing, learning their patterns, their weaknesses. He knew that confronting them directly, without proof, would be useless, perhaps even dangerous. The robbery of his down payment, the planted drugs, wasn't just a random act of criminality. It was the natural, ugly culmination of years of unchecked power, of a system that allowed two men to operate with impunity. For John, that night wasn't the first time he'd seen their corruption. It was simply the moment it finally touched him directly, shattering any lingering hope that the system would correct itself. It was the last straw, pushing him from passive observer to active participant in a battle he knew he had to win. He understood then that the initial act of aggression wasn't isolated. It was just the final, personal insult in a long line of abuses. The emotional atmosphere in the town became thick, like a heavy fog that never quite lifted. Miller and Jenkins's actions weren't just isolated incidents anymore. They were part of the daily landscape, changing how people interacted, how they lived. Their corruption wasn't subtle whispers. It was overt, a loud, grating noise that everyone heard, but few dared to acknowledge directly. Fear and distrust spread through the community, like a slow-burning fire, charring the edges of neighborly goodwill. Minor disagreements, the kind that used to be settled with a handshake or a quick chat, now became opportunities for the officers to exploit. A property line dispute could suddenly involve official warnings and threats of fines if one party didn't cooperate with the officer's suggested solution, which almost always benefited someone connected to them. Discussions among townspeople, once open and friendly, turned into hushed complaints, spoken in low tones behind closed doors or over the phone, always with a nervous glance over the shoulder. There was a growing resentment, a collective sigh of frustration that hung in the air. John felt the weight of it all. He saw the silent pleas in his neighbors' eyes, the frustrated glances they cast his way, as if asking him to do something, anything. But no one spoke up. The fear was too strong. He started feeling increasingly isolated, not because people avoided him, but because the very fabric of open communication had frayed. People were afraid to speak out, to even voice an opinion that might somehow reach the ears of Miller and Jenkins. The officer's presence cast a long, dark shadow over community gatherings. A town picnic might have a patrol car slowly cruise by, its occupants watching, and suddenly, laughter would die down. Conversations would stutter. It was a constant reminder of who was in charge, a subtle intimidation tactic that worked perfectly. Miller and Jenkins, sensing their unchecked power, became bolder with each passing day. Their arrogance grew, unchecked by any authority. They seemed to take pleasure in asserting their dominance, especially over those they perceived as weaker or less connected. Vulnerable individuals, particularly the elderly or those struggling financially, became easy targets. Small businesses, the lifeblood of the town, were squeezed for protection money disguised as donations or community support funds. If a business owner resisted, they might find their establishment subjected to frequent, inconvenient inspections, or their customers harassed with baseless traffic stops nearby. Their actions weren't just about money. They were about control, about instilling fear to maintain their grip. They enjoyed watching people squirm, enjoyed the deference that fear brought. They would make examples of people, publicly humiliating them for minor infractions, ensuring everyone else understood the consequences of stepping out of line. It was a performance, a twisted display of power designed to keep the town in line. John experienced an intense internal struggle. His disciplined nature, honed by years in the SEALs, urged him to remain calm, to analyze, to plan. But beneath that calm surface, a powerful desire for justice surged. He saw the suffering, the quiet desperation, and it gnawed at him. He knew what these officers were doing was fundamentally wrong, a perversion of the very oath they swore to uphold. The emotional suffocation was almost unbearable. Every day, he watched his community wither under their oppressive thumb. And every day, the feeling grew stronger that he had to act. He was reaching a peak of emotional pressure, a point where the disciplined exterior was barely holding back a tidal wave of righteous anger. He knew a breaking point was coming, not just for him, but for the entire town. Something had to give. The breaking point finally came, not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating whisper that reached John. He learned that Miller and Jenkins had targeted Mrs. Gable, a sweet, elderly woman who ran the town's small, beloved bakery. Mrs. Gable was a pillar of the community, known for her kindness and her legendary apple pies. She had been saving her meager earnings for years, hoping to put a new roof on her old shop, a place that held generations of memories for the town. The officers, however, saw her savings as their next easy score. They had cornered her, not in a dark alley, but right in her cozy bakery, after hours. They told her they had evidence of health code violations, fabricated charges that could shut her down for good. They threatened to frame her for selling drugs, claiming they'd found a small baggie of white powder in her flour bin. A baggie they had, of course, planted themselves. The price for their silence? Her entire savings, every last penny she had put aside for that roof. They made it clear that if she didn't comply, she would lose everything: her business, her home, her reputation. Mrs. Gable, terrified and heartbroken, had no choice but to hand over the cash. This revelation hit John like a physical blow. It wasn't just the money, it was the sheer cruelty. The targeting of an innocent, vulnerable woman who had done nothing but contribute goodness to their town. It wasn't a faceless victim. It was Mrs. Gable, whose pies he had eaten since childhood, whose gentle smile was a constant in the community. This wasn't just corruption. It was predatory evil. His sense of duty, his protective instincts, which had been simmering under the surface, now boiled over. This wasn't just about the town anymore. It was personal. John, pushed beyond his limits, knew he couldn't stand by any longer. The time for observation and quiet suffering was over. He made a solemn decision. He would act. His mind, trained for precision and strategy, immediately shifted into planning mode. He started meticulously gathering information, leveraging every bit of his SEAL training. He wasn't going to rush in like a hothead. He was going to dismantle their operation piece by piece. He began by discreetly interviewing other townspeople, not asking direct questions about Miller and Jenkins, but listening carefully to their stories, piecing together patterns of intimidation and extortion. He spent hours cross-referencing public records with whispered rumors, looking for discrepancies, for the cracks in their facade. Meanwhile, Miller and Jenkins, emboldened by their easy score from Mrs. Gable, became even more arrogant. They seemed to revel in their power. One afternoon, they made a public display of power that solidified John's resolve. They pulled over a local teenager, a quiet kid known for his artistic talent, for a broken taillight. Instead of a warning or a simple ticket, they publicly humiliated him, forcing him to empty his pockets on the sidewalk, then searching his car without a warrant, all while a small crowd gathered. They found nothing, of course, but the message was clear. They could do whatever they wanted, to whomever they wanted. John watched from a distance, the scene burning into his memory, fueling his determination. It was during one of his late-night planning sessions that John had a critical realization. He remembered the small, almost imperceptible device he'd adjusted on his wrist the night Miller and Jenkins had robbed him. It wasn't just a watch. It was a high-definition audio and video recorder designed for covert operations. He had activated it the moment Miller had shoved him against the car. He had the entire encounter, their threats, their theft, their planting of the evidence, all recorded. This footage, combined with the other evidence he was meticulously gathering, the testimonies, the financial irregularities, the patterns of harassment, would be undeniable. This was the moment that shifted the narrative from suffering to active retaliation. This was how he would fight back, not with violence, but with irrefutable truth. John faced a swirling storm inside him. Fear gnawed at the edges of his resolve. He knew challenging law enforcement, especially corrupt officers, was like walking into a minefield. The potential repercussions were huge, not just for him, but for everyone he cared about. Doubt crept in, whispering questions about whether he was doing the right thing, if he could truly win against a system that often protected its own. The weight of his decision pressed down, a heavy blanket of responsibility. But beneath the fear, a cold anger burned, fueled by the memory of Mrs. Gable's tear-streaked face and the teenager's public humiliation. That anger, he realized, was stronger than any fear. He went to Mrs. Gable first, carefully, gently. She was still shaken, almost catatonic with fear. It took days of patient visits, of just sitting with her, sometimes not saying a word before she started to open up. He didn't push. He just listened. When he finally showed her the blurry, almost abstract images from his wrist camera, images that captured Miller's sneer and Jenkins' silent watch, a flicker of something new appeared in her eyes. Not just terror, but a spark of indignation. She saw proof, not just her word against theirs. Slowly, reluctantly, she became a tentative ally. Her voice, though still trembling, became clearer as she recounted the threats, the shakedowns, the feeling of utter helplessness. Her testimony, he knew, would be crucial. As word of John's quiet inquiries began to spread, a strange shift happened in the small town. At first, there was skepticism, even fear. People had lived under the shadow of Miller and Jenkins for so long that challenging them seemed unthinkable. Some townspeople, those who had perhaps benefited from the officers' selective enforcement or were simply too afraid to rock the boat, became antagonists. They spread rumors, calling John a troublemaker, a disgruntled former soldier looking for a fight. They whispered that he was unstable, that he had a vendetta. These were the people who valued their own precarious peace over justice. People who would rather see the status quo maintained, no matter how rotten it was. But then, a handful of others, emboldened by Mrs. Gable's quiet courage and John's unwavering stance, slowly began to offer their support. Old Mr. Henderson, whose hardware store had been inspected countless times for phantom violations, shared his story. Maria, who ran the local diner, recounted how her brother had been wrongly ticketed and fined after refusing to give Miller a free meal. The collective desire for justice, long suppressed, began to bubble to the surface. It was a slow drip, not a flood, but each shared story added another piece to John's growing mountain of evidence. He carefully documented everything, cross-referencing names, dates, and incidents. The psychological impact on John was profound. The constant vigilance, the need to anticipate every move, the weight of the town's hopes and fears resting on his shoulders. It was exhausting. He slept little, his mind always racing, analyzing, planning. But his SEAL training, designed for high-stress environments and complex operations, kicked in. He found comfort in routine, in the meticulous organization of his evidence, in the disciplined approach to his task. He wasn't just fighting two corrupt cops. He was fighting for the soul of his community. He strategically leaked just enough information, carefully planting seeds of doubt and curiosity among the town's more respected figures, creating a controlled ripple effect. He wasn't looking for a mob. He was looking for truth to find its own way out. He knew the path ahead was long and dangerous, but he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. He had given the silenced a voice, and that, he realized, was a powerful weapon. John meticulously organized all the evidence he had gathered. It was a mountain of information. The footage from his wrist camera, Mrs. Gable's detailed accounts, the testimonies from Mr. Henderson and Maria, and countless other small stories and documents he had collected. He didn't just dump it on the local authorities. He knew Miller and Jenkins had connections, so he went higher, directly to the state attorney general's office, bypassing local channels entirely. He presented a meticulously compiled dossier, cross-referenced and airtight, making sure there were no gaps, no room for doubt or dismissal. His military training, especially in intelligence gathering and strategic planning, proved invaluable. He anticipated every possible countermove the officers might attempt: denial, claims of planted evidence, attempts to discredit witnesses. He had contingencies for each scenario, a Plan B and a Plan C. The state investigators, initially skeptical, were quickly swayed by the sheer volume and undeniable nature of the evidence. John had not only provided proof of the initial robbery and planting of drugs, but also established a clear pattern of extortion, intimidation, and abuse of power, stretching back years. The recordings, though brief, showed Miller's face, his words, and Jenkins' complicit silence. The witness testimonies, once hesitant and whispered, now formed a chorus of grievances, each story backing up the next. The arrest of Miller and Jenkins was swift and public. It happened on a Tuesday morning, right outside the precinct, as they arrived for their shift. State police cars, not local ones, surrounded them. The sight sent a shockwave through the town. People who had been too afraid to even speak their names now gathered, watching the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and grim satisfaction. The officers, once so arrogant and untouchable, looked utterly broken, their faces pale, and their shoulders slumped as they were led away in handcuffs. The evidence was indeed irrefutable. They were charged with multiple felonies, including extortion, assault, planting evidence, and official corruption. Their public downfall was complete and humiliating, a stark contrast to the power they had once wielded. The town, which had been so divided by fear and distrust, slowly began to heal. There was an awkward period of adjustment, as people learned to trust again, learned to speak freely without looking over their shoulders. But with Miller and Jenkins gone, a renewed sense of community began to emerge. The new police chief, brought in from outside the county, was a man with a reputation for integrity and community engagement. He held town hall meetings, listened to concerns, and slowly, painstakingly, rebuilt the trust that had been shattered. John, though scarred by the ordeal, found a profound sense of peace. He had upheld his principles, not with violence, but with truth and tenacity. His garage, once a distant dream, was now a reality, a symbol of honest work and a fresh start. He often sat in his new office, looking out at the main street, watching the town slowly come back to life. He thought about the true meaning of courage. It wasn't just about facing down an enemy in combat. It was also about standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible, even when it meant risking everything you had. It was about defending the vulnerable, giving a voice to the silenced, and holding power accountable. True strength, he realized, wasn't just in fighting battles, but in defending the very principles that defined a just society. He had fought a different kind of war, right here in his own backyard, and in doing so, he had helped his community find its way back to itself. The memory of that night, the cold street, the smirk on Miller's face, still lingered, but now it was a reminder of what he had overcome, a testament to the enduring power of integrity.